We're in such an agreeable mood that we're already onto the addendum. Isn't that nice? Why is, it's early yet. Yeah, you're right. This next one ought to be a show. Okay, we're on to item 6, consideration and discussion. Supervisor Miller, please.
Mr. Chairman, why would you say that? Hopefully it's not. Let's just put it that way. I have gone through the budget. We've all been through the budget process, and what I'm going to propose here today is that we go back to the drawing board and try to propose a budget that is tax neutral, so that the taxpayers don't have to bear the burden of another increase in taxes. A budget that accounts for rewarding the hardworking county employees with the raises as proposed by Supervisor Elias at the last meeting. And I know that tough decisions were made during the recession and the employees didn't get those raises that they deserved. And so the budget, what we need is a budget that is making progress, fixing the roads, which I'm really pleased with the $26 million that is being considered, and a budget that is more responsible with our tax dollars, and that won't pass the burden of these additional taxes, as I said earlier, on to the residents of Pima County. First, I'd like to recognize and give credit to all the positives in this year's budget proposal. Supervisor Bronson presented the award at the last meeting to the Finance Department for their work on this, and I have to say it was very well deserved. I really appreciated the complete thoroughness. I had very few questions that were unanswered when I came into the boardroom. There weren't many left, so I really appreciated that. It was presented clearly, accurate, and any questions that I did have, people responded very quickly and gave that additional information out. So I want to thank Mr. Huckleberry and his staff. And I really also agree with and support the pay-as-you-go capital improvement program policy that has been proposed. I think it is a very good step in the right direction to managing our budget without incurring more debt. And that the pay-as-you-go system supports capital projects as funds become available. It should essentially, you know, as we get down to it, remove the element of spending money that we don't have. And I think it's a good direction that we're headed in this year. And again, the pavement preservation contribution, the $26 million that is under consideration by the board, is a great step in the right direction for Pima County roads. I know everyone wants the problem solved yesterday, but as we know, that isn't going to happen. But I think this is really demonstrating to the taxpayers and the people of this community that we're serious about doing it. Is it enough? It never will be. This is going to be an ongoing problem, and we'll be facing it every year. But as the 97 HERF bonds are paid off, which are, I think, roughly $18 million this year that we're paying that, those monies can be moved into increasing the dollars in the future that can be provided for road repairs, as well as the expectations, at least in the next few years, that HERF revenues will be increasing, will also be helpful. And as we all know, it's going to be an ongoing challenge, and this board will need to collaborate to find this money, even more money, to fix the roads as we move forward. The proposal that I'm putting forward is just that. It's a proposal, a starting point, and I know that Supervisor Valadez talked about we have to begin the conversation, so I thought if I put this out there a few weeks ahead of time, it gives everyone time to review it, digest it, and decide whether or not it's something that you can support or improve upon. It's just a starting point. And the first thing I want to start with are the COPs, the certificates of participation. And I do have a handout here. I did have it. There it is. The certificates of participation are What I'm seeing is that it is a problem in that we're continuing to incur the debt, and we use these COPs to get around the expenditure limitation. And I do understand that. Mr. Huckleberry explained that in the last meeting about how this is an alternative to work around that so that we can continue doing the things we need to do. What I'm hoping and I'm proposing is that, you know, for example, we have roughly 117 million outstanding in COPS right now. I have the schedule that Mr. Huckleberry presented that shows that the payoff at that 117 million is going to be about 142 million, which is roughly $25 million in interest and issuance costs to pay those off. So what I'd like to see is that we start using fewer of the COPs, maybe forego the capital projects or try to hold off for a year or two and save those monies moving forward, invest those monies, get some interest in return, and save those monies and maybe wait a few years before we start making the investments that we'd like to right away. That's a possibility. And so if we just look at that 117 million, these were issued over a 5-year period, which amounts to about $23.5 million per year of issuance. So if we stop issuing those COPs for a year or two, we can earn some interest on those monies that we're using to pay back that 25 million roughly per year. We could truly do a pay-as-you-go budget by doing this. And so that is one thing I'd like to look at. The other thing was the flood control district, and I will give this copy to you here. This is just a brief summary of what I am proposing. Here's one for Mr. Huckleberry. Sorry about that. Should have handed those out to begin with. So if you took those COPs and didn't issue them, it's roughly $500,000 a year. Flood control district is looking at their budget this year is going to increase for CIP projects $8.4 million more than last year's contribution. And I know this would take a significant analysis, careful analysis of these projects, which ones are can be maybe pushed out into the future without compromising safety or any services, if that's possible. I'm proposing that we maintain our same level of safety, service, and funding equivalent to this year and reduce the pay-as-you-go by up to $8.4 million. And this is the starting point, as I said earlier. And then moving on to the general fund balance, after we moved up the salary increases, Supervisor Elias recommended we move them forward to July 1st. We're down to roughly $39 million balance in the reserve. So if we took 10% of that, which is $3.9 million, it would still leave a healthy balance of about $35 million. And then the question I did have on that, and obviously people will need time to respond to this, is that balance of $35 million enough to keep us within the range of keeping our bond rating in a safe area? And then I went through and analyzed various expenditures by object code that over the last 5 years were overrunning, and just added those up, and it came to roughly the average over the last 5 years is about $35 million. And obviously, some of those are probably going to be offset by underruns elsewhere. But I think that that would be a really good starting point to look into and see if there were, ask the county managers and department heads to go back and look at their budget and look at those items that are underrun and determine whether or not there are more cuts that could possibly be made there. And I have quite a bit of detail on the criteria that I use for that, but I just wanted to, put something on the table where we could begin a discussion. And these are possibly overestimated object expenses. And then the vacancies, the vacant positions, Mr. Huckleberry identified, I think it was 1,050 total vacant positions. And we all know we have to look at those very carefully because they have been eliminated, and I know there was a big effort to do that in the last few years to bring that down to the point where it's managing the attrition and hiring as needed. Pima County employees have carried a lot of additional workloads since the recession, and then when I saw this memorandum that identified these vacancies, I went ahead and I did an analysis on this expense and, removing ones that were grants and, looking at the enterprise departments, et cetera. Roughly, conservatively, there's about 50 million tied up in the budget for vacancies, and that's a pretty conservative estimate. And understanding many of these do need to be hired, and we have to account for the attrition and to provide a more accurate analysis. And I think Chuck stated approximately 700 of those vacancies are part of our attrition and turnover rate, if I recall correctly. You can correct me if I'm wrong. That leaves approximately 350 vacant positions in a conservative range of about $50,000 per employee. That's a pretty significant amount of money. So if we looked at that using the approach taking down the vacancies from 1,050 to 980, cutting 70 of those, that's about a $3.5 million that we could potentially put towards a tax neutral budget. And I said I was presenting this because of Supervisor Valadez's comment that good governance requires open dialogue, so I wanted to put this on the table. And I know this is the first time that anyone is seeing this, so it probably won't have a lot of discussion today, or possibly will. And I'm aware the details of getting this done are a lot more difficult than just cutting and pasting and just saying, okay, here we go. So I put this all together, and if you add up all those items, and the other one is the library, which I don't have in here, but that was a potential as well, the library going up, the rate going up 2 cents, which amounts to about, I think, 1.7 million of their $3.3 million increase. If there's any way we could push back some of the hiring, because I believe it was for 12 new positions, move that out, or possibly look at other ways to try to reduce that impact. And so if I look at that total value, I came up with roughly 51 million there, and recognizing that the overestimated object codes, by the time you get through and go through those, it probably won't be that full 35 million. But if I just look at that, and then I look at what we need to get to have a tax neutral budget so that we don't increase taxes, is roughly 10.5 million. I took the 1.05% that Mr. Huckleberry said was due to the new growth. I know these numbers won't be exact, but it's basically 10.5 million that we have to come up with. And if you look at, it's less than 21% of the value of what we just talked about on these few items, that comes to 10.7 million. And if we take that 21% and apply it to the vacant positions, that means an elimination out of those 1,015 positions, just to get revenue neutral. And we're almost there. It's less than 1% reduction in the budget to get there. And I just wanted to put this on the table, and if anyone is interested in discussing it, I have more details. And I wanted to give it to you, Mr. Huckleberry, and all of the board members to give you time, because I appreciate last year that, presenting this the day of the budget adoption was not going to work, and wasn't fair. So at least we've got something on the table, and I don't know if other people have recommendations or suggestions to consider. But I wanted to get this out there so that we had a point of discussion for the next board meeting.
Mr. Chairman,
Supervisor.
I want to thank Supervisor Miller for this. I think there are certainly some items I'm willing to look at. And just this is a question for Mr. Huckleberry. I think the recommendations that Supervisor Miller is making are worthy of consideration. It all comes down to crunching the numbers. So, and I worry about the library because that is one of the things our constituents actually use and benefit by, rather than the justice and law enforcement system, where most of our money goes. So when do you think we could have information or have a response to her suggestions?
Mr. Chairman and members of the board, I think we can respond to probably all of these and give the board some policy options probably within the week. And so I definitely think that you know, you're going to look at adopting the final budget on the 19th. And so I think by the Thursday before, so that gives Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, 5 days to look at kind of what our views of these proposals are, and to give you some options and talk about, if you want to do this, here's what you have, you know, kind of a back and forth that says, if you would like to do this, here's the impacts and here's what we need to do.
Mr. Chairman?
Supervisor.
I too want to commend and express my appreciation to Supervisor Miller for putting these items out for discussion. I have just a couple of questions that she's brought forth that, for clarity, would it be appropriate? Can I ask questions of them? You talked about certificates of participation and the use of them and how you'd like to curtail them over a couple of years to accrue the interest rates that would normally have been applied to any new use of the COPS to pay for old debt. Am I clear in assuming that, given that process which you expressed, you do approve of the use of COPS?
No, I don't like the COPS, but I recognize, you know, we're in a situation, and I don't like that we're going around the expenditure limitation by utilizing the COPS. So I'm not a real fan of them. And as I pointed out, if you look at that $117 million in COPS, we're paying $25 million in interest and issuance costs over the lifetime of those COPS. So I'd prefer that we use less of them. I recognize, you know, we're between a rock and a hard spot right now that we can't totally stop using them, but I'd like to see less use of them. And you know, I'm looking at a best case scenario here. The 500,000 savings would be a best case scenario if we didn't issue any more next year.
More than 500,000 savings, wouldn't it?
No, if you assume, what I did was I looked at the interest rates on the outstanding COPS, and I came up with the savings if you invested those monies at that interest rate that the COPS were. I guess what
I'm saying as a last resource or a last resort, given that the preceding procedure is followed of reducing or not using COPS, there might be instances where COPS could be justified?
I don't really like the use of COPS, period, but I am sure, you know, and I just think if that's why I'm requesting maybe we push some things out, maybe some capital expenditures. And, you know, some of the ones you look at is, could we, and that here I simply identified flood control, but there's other things that we could look at, obviously, but I just wanted to get something on the table. But you know, I would like to avoid them as much as possible, but you know, as we know, we've got these outstanding COPS now, but if we stopped issuing them, instead of making that 25, we could invest that money, right? Invest that money, and I don't know if you saw the chart that Mr. Huckleberry presented. It was, where is it, right here? And he shows the annual payments, like in 2020, it's $27.4 million. And
That-
so.
That's the figure I was looking at.
Right.
the Savings.
Yeah, but I just took the average of because there was 5 years worth of cops, and I divided that total number of 117 by the 5, and came up with the average of, close to 24 million. And then I took the interest rate, the average interest rate of all the various cops, and applied that. And so if you invested that money, instead of paying back cops with it, you could earn roughly 500,000, a little slightly more than that. But that's just a perfect case scenario if you completely stop. So that's making some assumptions there that obviously we're not going to be doing. But I thought, it's a starting point, a place to start looking for some savings.
And on pay-as-you-go, do you foresee or do you feel that there might be procedural problems as to how that's managed? In other words, my understanding with pay-as-you-go is we accumulate money, and once that money is accumulated, it can be sort of deliberated upon as to where to spend it for various projects. Do you see anything is on the horizon that might cause that procedure to become complicated or controversial?
No, the board votes on those projects now. It's a decision by the board majority, so, and Mr. Huckleberry puts together a capital plan every year, and the various departments do, so I don't see it, I don't think it would change anything.
Okay.
I think we all vote on it and make that decision.
And finally, on the $26 million for roads, the Pima County Transportation Advisory Committee made a recommendation that monies be split 5 ways evenly amongst all the supervisory districts. Naturally, that's a kind of a PTAC item at this point to deliberate, but if that were indeed to be the case, what is your feeling on that money being evenly split?
This is going to come before the board to be deliberated upon. I'd like it all in District 1. Sharon wants it all in 3, you want it all in 4. I think, we can have that discussion, and I know that, we all have our feelings about the way things should be split, and we can, I hope we have an open discussion and we can come to a reasonable agreement. And if people feel very strongly that it should be evenly split, and that's the way the board decides, I can live with that. As I said, I'd rather not have that, but, we have to make sure we accommodate everyone and treat everyone fairly. So, and I think everyone here will have an open discussion. I think everyone here will come to a good decision, I hope.
And then your suggestion to take, I want to make sure that this is how it's being described, to make sure everything remains tax neutral. The monies in order to do that, are you suggesting it might come from the reserve balance of 3 point?
This is just put forth as a possibility, and as you see, I was just talking about let's take 10% out of there and look at that, and then if we needed to get money from reserve, we could. And again, we'd need the analysis from Mr. Huckleberry as to what we need to do to maintain our bond rating. But if we were able to go down a little more, and obviously, this is going to, as he said, it's going to be a back and forth, and we're going to have to look at every item carefully and make sure that, we're not going to. But if you look at what I'm proposing to remain tax neutral out of the general fund, it's less than $1 million. So, and that's what I'm hoping. We can just get to a tax neutral budget, moving this money into roads, doing the pay-as-you-go. I just think this is trying to keep it so that taxpayers don't have to absorb another increase. I think with the increased valuations, I think would, make the residents of Pima County.
Well, I, for one, want to thank you for your clarity and for putting these items out there. I think it's a terrific starting point, and I'm very much in favor of continuing the discussion based upon these recommendations that Supervisor Miller has proposed, and I'm looking forward to the analysis from the county administrator. But again, thank you, Supervisor Miller, for this
You're welcome.
opportunity.
Mr. Chairman?
Supervisor.
Mr. Chairman, I also want to thank Supervisor Miller for taking the discussion that we had last year during the final budget adoption, because regardless of whether or not this turns out, this is really worth talking about, if for nothing else, to make sure that we have a public discussion about these items. So I know that you're going to get the details over Mr. Huckleberry, and what I'd like to ask Mr. Huckleberry to do is a couple of different things. First, on a macroscopic level, I'd like to hear in that memorandum from Mr. Huckleberry a really kind of cost-benefit analysis to having a tax-neutral budget. Obviously, the benefit is that we're going to be tax-neutral, but is there a cost to doing that? And if so, what is that? So the first question we need to answer is whether or not that's something worth achieving. And I don't know the answer to that right now. But certainly it is worth exploring and worth discussing in a public venue. Then secondly, what I'd like to have as part of that discussion in that memorandum is I'm particularly concerned with the interplay between the expenditure cap and the pay-as-you-go, because it sounds really great to be able to get things out of the COP so that we don't have a cost of money issue, but I don't know how you interplay the cost of that with putting back into under the expenditure cap the cost of those pay-as-you-go items. So there may be a practical issue in how we put that expenditure there. So I want that to be analyzed further, because I'm really concerned that it work still. Because on the superficial level, it does sound like a really great idea, but I don't know whether or not, if we're putting the entire amount of a project under the expenditure cap, whether that's going to force us into cutting other expenditures in other departments and other elected officials in the other parts of the budget. So there may be a practical aspect as to whether or not we can do that moving forward. Then shifting back to that interplay again, I guess we need to do an analysis of whether or not which philosophy of, again, a cost-benefit philosophy, of the philosophy between pay-as-you-go as you accrue the money and pay-as-you-go as you use 3-year financing mechanism through the COPS, factoring obviously in there the cost of money that we just discussed in your discussion as well as a timing issue. If we start pushing back projects, because obviously we've got an expenditure cap issue now, what does that mean in terms of infrastructure, roads, and other things that we need to get done in terms of the community? We need to know the answer to those questions so we can make a really informed decision as to whether or not that is worth moving forward, because if it isn't, and it pushes necessary projects that are necessary within the next 2 years out to 5, 7, and 8 years, and it creates a real issue, that could be an issue. So I want to hear about those in the memo, and then obviously other relevant factors that maybe we haven't thought about yet.
Yeah, obviously, I didn't include the library because of the reasons that
Right.
Supervisor Bronson brought up, is because, the libraries are a very valuable asset in the community. Also, on here, as you see, I have 105,000 attributed to the reduction in COPS, and I mean, we recognize we are where we are, and we're in a situation. I'd just like to see a move gradually away, and not obviously all at once. And so I agree with you that there could be issues if we tried to do that. And I look forward to that analysis. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I agree with anything Ellie said, but what I would say is that I do agree with her about salaries for our employees. They should start July 1. I was expecting them to start September 1, but July 1 is great with me. So that would be my comment on it. And I'll be circumspect until I see some analysis from the county manager.
Mr. Chairman, I thought that you brought that up at the last meeting.
I did, but I suggested that the increased raise amount will start in September, as Mr. Huckleberry had suggested, as opposed to July 1 like you suggested in your
Oh, I
comment.
thought you said July 1. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I'm down for July 1. It's all
I thought
good
you
with
were
me.
pulling it back to July 1.
I'm not going to fight on that one. But I'll remain circumspect on the rest of it until I see some analysis.
Mr. Chairman, just one observation regarding the roads, and I guess I can't help myself.
Sure.
But 26
Isn't
million.
there a bunch of people on the TPAC or what's the name of that, Transportation Committee?
There is.
Is there a bunch of people that like roads?
Yeah, apparently so.
So, God, doesn't that make them the same as Klepsy?
I don't think that's a good analysis at all.
I was just
Or-
wondering out loud. It's okay, go ahead, Supervisor, I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, you're not.
All right, I'm not.
When you have $26 million a year, and we look at the amount of money out there that we really need to address our roads, and you divide that into the amount we need in the years, what are we looking at, Mr. Huckleberry, on that regard? It should be maintained that we still have a funding issue, and we've all acknowledged that on our road repair.
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Christie, it's a long time, and I think if you think of our maybe unincorporated road repair, it's in this range of, depending upon who you ask and what condition they want to see all our roads in, anywhere from probably $600 to $800 million. So you can start doing the math, divide 26 into that, it gets to be a long time. With the exception that, as you recall, in this pay-as-you-go structure, I was building that contribution up about $5 million a year, and that's the same time. At the same time, we're seeing increased revenues in HERF and VLT and reduced debt service. So that 26 was growing to a fairly large number within 5 years, and so it's all problematic. And I think the issue is how do you assume how fast do we? And this is a good discussion, because frankly what it means is how fast do you want to transition to pay-as-you-go. And we can have a long discussion on the COPS, because I think we need to divide the COPS, and we've done it a little bit, but we've just done them by years, is into short term and medium term. We don't have any real long term. And then look at the cost on the short term and the medium term, and is there a way to accelerate the medium term payoff so that interest drain is reduced. And the final analysis to COPS is the question of expenditure limit, voter increase. So you got to basically have the voters really understand what an expenditure limit is, and if it's increased, you don't have to go through these gyrations that cost them money. That's a hard sell, but I think that's the reality, and those are the kind of things that we can explain in a little more detail in the memorandum that we can prepare on the alternatives.
Mr. Chairman, and that is why I attributed just that small $105,000 amount out of there, is recognizing that obviously we're not going to be able to do this quickly, transition, but if we could head in that direction without the debt, we'll be able to, because our debt is also going down. What is it going down from 69 cents to 52 cents next year, fiscal year 2021?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, I think it's 17 cents. And again, the way we structured, and again, it's really the board's decision. We actually, in growing the pay-as-you-go fund, only took half of that in this forecast. And so as it dropped, we only moved half of it into the primary, knowing that we still needed to try and drop the primary. Right. And as I said, as you can build this pay-as-you-go fund the way we did, which was giving back and that's why we're having to do these truth and taxation notices. We gave back about half of the appreciation. And so there comes a point where you build the fund enough that you can then return to and have a consistent tax neutral levy. But it depends upon, as one example says, well, if you want to not do pay-as-you-go this year, what we probably put in somewhat of jeopardy is the $5 million general fund transfer, unless we want to do something more with the fund balance. But on the other hand, you could next year say, I want to take the full 17 cents and push it to basically the pay-as-you-go fund. And because in the debt service fund, there is no truth in taxation notice requirements because it's voter approved. So it's whether it goes up or goes down, requires no real notice on truth in taxation.
Thank you.
Very good. That was actually a rational conversation.
Sort of.
Not on my part. Okay.